Hey, greetings everyone. It is GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we read the Chronicles where we kind of started talking about how the Blood Elves are going to become the Blood Elves, why they're going to become the Blood Elves, why they call themselves the Blood Elves, where it all comes from. But it was a really cursory, just the Chronicles treatment, and sometimes Chronicles gets in depth. This time it really kind of glossed it over. So we're going to dive into a story that we've read a couple chapters of, which is The Blood of the Highborne. We're going to read the third chapter in this kind of mini novella kind of a thing. The last one was, chapter 2 was insane. The longest straight reading episode that we've done. This will be the only chapter we read in this phase, and this just kind of addresses up close and personal why the elves call themselves the Blood Elves, why the High Elves become the Blood Elves. So stay a while and listen to chapter 3 of Blood of the Highborne, which is called Darkening of the Sunwell. It's going to be a kind of a long one, but not nearly as long as the last one. So hope you enjoy. Lorthamar waited anxiously just inside the eastern gate on the debris-strewn grounds that had once been the bazaar, amid the dismal ruins of Silvermoon. Sorry, excuse me. Haldron approached. Lorthamar knew the answer to his impending question, but he asked anyway. Any change? The ranger shook his head. Lorthamar simply nodded, trying to mask the grave concern he felt for his friend Galel. Upon their arrival at Silvermoon, Lorthamar and the remaining forest riders had gathered together all the survivors they could find. They established a defensible position within the square and fought back the wandering dead that maintained a vigil throughout the ruined capital in the wake of Arthas' departure. The following day, the forest riders had conducted this sweeping perimeter searches for anyone they might have missed, or anyone who may be trying to reach the city. Lorthamar had come across Galel unconscious, washed up on the eastern shore along with scattered heaps of driftwood, the bodies of a few guardians, and the corpse of a macabre bat-like creature, similar to the fallen beasts that littered the inner squares and grounds outside of the city. Those corpses were, of course, burned, just as this one would be. Upon their return, the Farstriders had deposited Galel in the back room of one of the few structures still fully intact, a two-story affair that had been in its life before the devastation, a popular tavern. That same day, a handful of survivors from Quel'Danas had arrived, among them two brothers, Falan and Solinar. As they had approached, Lorthamar had noted one of the elves carrying a body of a gaunt, armored figure with gleaming white hair. Amazingly, the brothers had retrieved the fallen king Anasterion. Tales of the brothers' courage quickly spread among their fellow elves, providing a tiny boost to the spirits of the survivors, whose moods continued to grow increasingly bleak. Still, there was more to the depression than the fog of despair and confusion that lingered in the disaster's aftermath. There was the matter of the Sunwell. The fount had undergone some sort of transformation. Lorthamar knew it, and whether or not the other survivors spoke of it, and Lorthamar believed they did, just not within his earshot, they knew it as well. Nevertheless, such concerns were best left to practitioners of magic. As a ranger lord, it was Lorthamar's duty to see to the security of those who remained, and that was exactly what he intended to do. Later, Galel awoke. Lorthamar rushed to his side and thanked the sun that the priest was coherent once again, but a closer inspection of his friend dampened the ranger's celebratory mood. Galel was awake, that much was true, but looking into his eyes was like peering into the windows of a vacant home. The priest was completely unresponsive, speaking not a single word, only staring blankly in the general direction of the wall before him. Okay. Just double checking the audio since this is going to be a long one. I don't want to have to redo it. A week passed, and still his condition had not changed. Lorthamar worried for Galel, but he worried even more for the one whom over the years he had grown to respect and value above all others in his circle of friends. He worried for Liadrin. Survivors continued to trickle in, and each time a survivor surfaced, Lorthamar hoped to see a high priestess's face. See the high priestess. But as time passed, the flow of survivors slowed to almost nothing, and still Liadrin had not arrived. Lorthamar began to fear the worst, and the thought that she might have perished left him with a cold and desolate desperation deep within. And so Lorthamar chose to focus on the task at hand, while never abandoning hope that Liadrin still lived. Now all stood just inside the gates, awaiting the arrival of Anastarion's only son, Caelthas. The prince had spent a great deal of time in Dalaran, pursuing his education with Kirin Tor, an elite cadre of the most powerful wizards in the known world. Caelthas could have teleported directly into the city square, of course, a minuscule feat for someone of the prince's ability, but the son of Anastarion chose to travel in from the south to assess the full extent of the devastation to the kingdom and to the city, both from the outside and within. Such was the message delivered to Lorthamar by the prince's advisor Rawmath, who had teleported to the city 4 days ago. Unfortunately, he arrived in Falconwing Square, a section of the city not yet reclaimed by the Forest Riders. Nonetheless, the Magister proved more than capable, battling his way through scores of undead, searching for survivors, and finally reaching the safe harbor of the Bazaar. Despite his relief at the arrival of the prince's advisor, Lorthamar found Rawmath himself to be somewhat off-putting. The elf was quiet, with penetrating eyes and a chilling disposition. Even as the two stood now, waiting with the other survivors, the Ranger Lord felt a mild discomfort in the Magister's presence, and Rawmath's brusque manner had done little to placate the despondent survivors. The Magister had not made an official announcement, and had in fact advised Lorthamar that it would be prudent to maintain secrecy regarding the exact time and method of Caelthas' appearance, so as to thwart any possible designs of a traitor in our midst, as he had curtly put it. Lorthamar himself had spent several days thinking about the temples, about how the enemy could have discovered their location so easily, how that same enemy would have known to use the moon crystals, and he thought about Darkhan and how the mage had inquired as to the kingdom's defenses, how he had taken a keen interest in the temples and the crystals. And the hopeful part of Lorthamar, the trusting part of him, tried desperately to deny what he increasingly knew to be the truth. A traitor in our midst. If it was true, then Lorthamar too had played a part in Silvermoon's downfall by not being vigilant enough, by being too trusting, by being naive. And so Lorthamar continued to hope, despite the evidence to the contrary, that he was mistaken. Late that day, when the prince finally did arrive, he arrived quietly, without fanfare, accompanied by a handful of archers, 2 priests, the royal guard, and another magister, an unassuming and soft-spoken elf named Astalor. The prince's features marked him unmistakably and proudly as a member of the Sunstrider line, the high cheeks, the slender nose, and the cerulean eyes that conveyed sadness but strength and a depth of knowledge that Lorthamar could only guess at. As the prince entered the square, murmurs among many of the survivors arose. "Too late now. Leave as soon as he gets the chance. Why should we linger here anyway?" If Caelthas heard the remarks, he gave no reaction. He simply surveyed the destruction, his features and emotions equally guarded. Lorthamar genuflected. "Your Highness, I am pleased to see that you arrived safely." Caelthas motioned for Lorthamar to rise. "Yes, we encountered only small pockets of resistance." The prince seemed hesitant to use the word undead. Caelthas stepped forward and swept his eyes across the survivors, seeming to search for the appropriate thing to say. "I know this has been difficult," he began, but the protests of the survivors surfaced once again. "How would you know of our difficulties?" "Just tell us how we will eat, how we are to survive." "Quiet yourselves and let him speak." This last was from Fallon. "We need actions now, not words." Caelthas fell silent. The survivors argued fiercely, acknowledging nothing and no one else. The prince sighed and turned. "I should like to see my father." Lorthamar inclined his head. "As you wish, your highness." A lone table sat within the main hall of the tavern. The king lay there in silent repose, his shimmering white hair a blanket of snow over the tabletop. Resting on his chest, pommel positioned just under his chin, was Fellow Malorn, the 2 pieces laid together to form the complete sword. Caelthas ran his finger along the seam where the 2 pieces met. Lorthamar offered almost apologetically, "Shattered, your highness, in the battle." "I did not think it possible." Caelthas's eyes sought out his father's face. The prince's tone softened. "There were many things I did not believe possible until now." A moment passed in silence. "The other bodies, where are they?" "Burned, my liege, to prevent their being raised again." The prince's incredulous eyes shot to the Ranger Lord. He briefly processed the notion and nodded. "Of course. I will be just outside the door." Lorthamar stepped out and propped the broken door closed behind him. Even so, he could hear the prince's somber voice. Gorbindel Falalan Morinamanor. The prince began with a Thalassian blessing. I knew this day would come, but I never dreamed it would come so soon. I fear I am not ready, Father. You are the king. You will always be the king. There was the sound of cloth rubbing, and though he could not see it, Lorthamar imagined the prince kneeling at his father's side. I only ever wanted to make you proud. Grant me the strength to be the man you hoped I would be. Grant me the strength to carry us through this time of despair. Grant me the strength now to lead our people true. The prince offered a final prayer. Alumani al-Mal Allah. That evening, a pyre was made, and Anastarion's body was put to the flame. When the pyre was lit, all eyes turned expectantly to Caelthas, but the prince's thoughts remained his own. He kept his distance, flanked by Astalor and Ramath. When the flames obscured the king's body from further view, Caelthas and the Magi retreated once again into isolation, into the refuge of the tavern. Are we on our own, then? Are we to guess? Are we to guess at the prince's thoughts? Will he not even make a speech? Could we not use a stirring speech now? This rant came from Voronel, a tall craftsman who hailed from Sunstrider Isle. Lorthamar spread his hands and motioned for silence, his features bathed in the fire's orange glow. The prince will issue his address in due time. Until then we have stores of food and cisterns of fresh water. What supplies we may not have immediately on hand we can procure. Remain calm and try to remain patient. As the murmuring subsided, the Ranger Lord looked back at the darkened structures and could not help but wonder himself why the prince chose to lurk in secrecy. Over the next 2 days, the prince virtually disappeared from sight, as did Ramath and Astalor. During this time, roving bands of undead, some decomposed corpses, some ambulatory skeletons, some fallen elves that could have passed for living if not for their vapid, wide-eyed stares and sluggish gait, continued to search for a way through the defenses, but were repelled by the Farstriders' combined efforts. Although their defenses held, Lorthamar felt increasingly drained. In the past few days, it was all he could do to rouse himself from sleep. He checked regularly on Galel, sometimes sitting with him for extended periods of time, talking, trying to evoke any kind of response, but always his efforts proved futile. At one of these sessions, he asked if Galel knew what had become of Liadrin, and for the briefest instant the Ranger thought he glimpsed the tiniest response, the slightest hint, a movement of the eye at the mention of Liadrin's name, but then it was gone. On the morning of the third day, Caelthas and his entourage ventured out past the gate, offering no explanation as to the purpose of their mission or the time for their return. The survivors had grown increasingly vocal in their distrust of the prince, and Lorthamar worried that an all-out riot might erupt if events continued following their present course. Falon and Solinar had been helpful in striving to maintain order, but the Ranger Lord feared that even their patience was near to breaking. Several hours later, the prince returned, flanked by the magisters, carrying an object covered in cloth. They hastily made for the tavern and remained there for the rest of the day. An inventory of the elves' supplies indicated that food stocks were running low. The Farstriders would have to venture into the unclaimed sectors of the city within the next few days, and Lorthamar decided it was high time for him to have a talk with the prince, to inform him of the people's plummeting morale, to try to break through the wall of silence that continued to surround Caelthas and his companions. That talk never transpired, for that evening Caelthas emerged and asked Lorthamar to gather the survivors for an announcement. The prince appeared somewhat anxious as he stared out from a makeshift platform of structural remains. Ramath and Astalor stood on either side. The crowd called out, "Where are we to go? How much food is left? Why the silence?" Caelthas' voice, clear and commanding, proclaimed, "I have been to the Sunwell." The crowd fell silent. Lorthamar suddenly understood at least part of what the prince had been up to when he had disappeared for hours at a time. He had teleported to the Sunwell and back. Caelthas continued, "I have sampled its energies, and my suspicions and the suspicions of my magisters have been confirmed. The Sunwell has been fouled, defiled, its energies contaminated by necromancy. The undead have flocked to Quel'Danas, drawn to the ancient fountain like moths to a flame. The same energy that calls to them, the same power that continues to pervade our beings, will spread throughout what is left of our kingdom, throughout the land itself, infecting, corrupting, poisoning with its all-consuming evil." Someone from the crowd shouted, So we should leave. Get as far away from it as we can. There's nothing here for us anyway. The Sunwell suffuses us no matter where in this world we may be. We cannot outrun it or outdistance it. Our reality is this. We must make our stand here, now, or risk losing everything. We've already lost everything, a young female countered. No, you have your lives. And while we have our lives, we have also this land. This is still our home. We can rebuild, but not with the Sunwell's threat looming over us. What are you suggesting, then? This was from Fallon. It is not a suggestion, it is imperative. The Sunwell must be destroyed. The crowd broke again into protests, a cacophony where Voronel had to fight to be heard. Our lust for magic has always led to disaster. It is what our Kalderai cousins tried to warn us of. I say, destroy it. The cursed thing should never have existed anyway. There were several shocked and angry reactions to this, but there were also many among the survivors who, whether they would admit it openly or not, believed Voronel's words to be true. There is a more immediate and far more dire threat than our precious Sunwell, a female voice called out from the direction of the gate. All eyes turned to see a robed figure standing just outside the threshold. Lorthamar in particular felt an overwhelming relief at the sound of her voice. He began working his way through the crowd to get a better view, to ensure that his eyes would confirm what his heart wished, and confirm it they did. And what might this immediate threat be? The prince asked. Liadrin strode forth looking disheveled and sullied, yet strong, unwavering, and very much alive as she replied, Trolls. They have been filing into Zulaman from far and wide for several days now. Every Imani, it seems, is emerging from hiding, rallying for war. Liadrin sat within the tavern opposite Kael'thas at the very table where Anastarian's body had lain just a few days ago. Between them a large object sat covered in cloth. Lorthamar paced Alderon nearby. A royal guard stood at the prince's side, and behind the guard Astalor. Rameth lurked unseen in the shadows. The prince retorted, Why amass such an army to destroy us? Surely they could have swooped in days ago before we regrouped and vanquished us with relative ease. Liadrin leaned forward. Perhaps it is no longer us they are after. Lorthamar stopped. His eyes met Liadrin's, and he nodded. Long ago, Lorthamar, I, and 2 others were captured by Zul'jin. He was obsessed with the Sunwell. I do not know if Zul'jin is among them now or not. From the corner of her eye, Liadrin noticed Halderon lowering his head. But I do believe that the Sunwell will be their target. I climbed to the highest ground I could access, a remote peak east of Zulaman. Looking out over the ocean, I saw several ships. Destroyers. Kael'thas sighed. So they have no doubt spied the undead occupying Quel'Danas. There are multitudes on the island, their numbers growing by the day. It was all the Magisters and I could do to sample the Sunwell's energies and get out alive. Astalor offered, The trolls are likely unaware of what kind of power the remaining undead wield. They only know that this scourge sacked Silvermoon, a feat they could never achieve. And so they prepare accordingly, not realizing that the undead's most powerful agents are long gone. The prince leaned back in his chair, pensive. Very well, this may be just the opportunity we need. If the trolls want the Sunwell, they shall have it. Kael'thas stood and removed the cloth from the object on the table to reveal the joined moon crystals, then began pacing around them. Arthas, in the time I knew him, he was little more than an uncouth and undisciplined knave. Yet somehow he utilized our moon crystals as conduits to shatter our defenses. Liadrin nodded. That is so. I witnessed it myself. The prince continued. Then we shall use them as well. The Magisters and I will channel enough power through the crystal to destabilize the Sunwell, and if my calculations are correct, destroy it. A heavy silence fell over the room as each of them weighed the import of the prince's words. He stopped pacing and lowered his eyes to Liadrin. You believe the trolls will attack soon? Yes, A scout post near the far side of the mountains over Zulaman could alert us when they mobilize. Indeed, and so it will be. We will time our operation with the trolls' attack, and when they flock to Quel'Danas, we will wipe them and the undead that remain there off the face of the world. Astalor broke in. With our energies focused on the channeling, we will be unable to hold the undead at bay. The prince concurred. We will need a fighting force to drive the undead back long enough to give Romath, Astalor, and me time to complete our task. The undead will also be occupied with the attacking trolls, so a handful of defenders at the Sunwell should be sufficient. I will not conscript any of the survivors against their wishes, but I will accept volunteers. Lorthamar stepped forward. The Farstriders stand ready to fight at your side. Hear, hear, voiced Halduran. Liadrin stood. I shall join you as well. Kael'thas eyed the High Priestess's robes. Good. We can use another healer. I will not be channeling the light. The prince raised an eyebrow. No? And why is that? Liadrin's voice turned acrid. What good is a force that fails to perform when it is most needed? The light is a fickle and worthless thing, and I will have none of it. As of the day my mentor died, I was a High Priestess no longer. Lorthamar eyed Liadrin with concern. Kael'thas remained silent. Romath, however, had stepped out of the shadows and in fact seemed to be listening intently. Lorthamar offered, Perhaps, then, it would be best if you remained. Liadrin intoned a Thalassian epithet that raised the Ranger Lord's eyebrows. Nonsense. I will fight. She crossed to the wall where the Farstriders had stacked many of the weapons they had taken from the various defeated undead. There she kneeled and retrieved a truncheon. I am sure one of your men can show me how to use this. Before Lorthamar could answer, a final voice called from the doorway of the back room. I do not know if I am capable of channeling the light yet, but I will help any way I can. Galel leaned against the door jamb, looking like someone who had just awakened from a long and especially fitful slumber. Liadrin called out his name, rushed over, and embraced him. Lorthamar smiled and clapped the priest on the shoulder, and for that brief moment, in spite of everything that had befallen them and all the hardships that lay ahead, Liadrin, Lorthamar, and Galel felt a warm peace. When Kael'thas solicited volunteers from the survivors, the brothers Fallon and Solinar were the first to step forward. A handful more soon joined them. Now the group stood in the center of what used to be the bazaar, 20 intrepid souls carrying the destiny of an entire people on their weary shoulders. The eyes of the refugees surrounding them bespoke a desperate anxiety, but deep within, embers of hope burned there as well. A Farstrider rushed into the gate to deliver the news. The scout's flaming arrow had been shot into the sky. The signal had been given. In his hands, Kael'thas held the sacred moon crystals. He spoke a single word of Thalassian, and the large gem split into 3. He handed one to Romath, a second to Astalor. Dark clouds rolled across the sky. The time has come, Kael'thas announced as a driving wind blew in from the west. May the light of the sun guide us to the very end. If fate allows, we will rejoin you with new promise for the future of us all. If we do not return, then may you all find eternal peace. And with that, Kael'thas, Romath, and Astalor raised their free hands simultaneously, and as one, the group of 20 dissipated into the glittering specks of light that were soon scattered by the rising wind. A vast and writhing ocean of undead surrounded the Sunwell, their numbers stretching out over the entirety of Quel'Danas. Rapid percussive booms split the air, a sound that was not thunder but heavy cannon. To the southeast, an armada of troll destroyers lingered off the coast, broadsides facing the shoreline, maintaining a steady and powerful artillery bombardment of the island. Along the ship sides not facing the shore, transport boats, bristling with troll warriors, were launched. Many of the undead closest to the outer edges of Quel'Danas had already ventured into the sea to claw at the ships when Kael'thas and the others appeared around the Sunwell. Lightning forked overhead. Those undead that had been pushed aside by the party's arrival attacked immediately, if sluggishly, and the battle began in earnest. Lorthamar and the Farstriders lashed out, driving the nearest corpses back, providing room, carving a circle around the radiating beam that disappeared overhead into the roiling thunderclouds. Kael'thas, Romath, and Astalor took positions about the corrupted beam. Kael'thas was joined by one of his personal priests. His second joined Astalor. The brothers had agreed that Fallon would situate himself near Romath, but at the last second Fallon insisted Solinar take his place. There is no time to argue, Valen shouted over the gusting wind as the Farstriders fought furiously. I am the Elder, and I will be of better use out there. Reluctantly, Solinar acquiesced to his brother's wishes as Valen rushed to the aid of one of the wounded rangers. Galel struck out to support the front line. He hoped he was making the right decision. After all, he had withdrawn not only from the light, but also from the world for several days. Struggling to reestablish his connection to the light was like stumbling through a familiar room in the dark. The landscape hadn't changed, but his outlook had. He needed to reorient himself, to find his way once again. The prince and the magisters closed their eyes, whispering words of power. The moon crystals began casting a faint glow. A troll cannonball hit nearby, casting a massive cloud of stone, dust, debris, and corpse body parts. Lorthamar skewered the putrefied horror before him and glanced back at Kael'thas. In the purple glow of the coruscating lights, the prince looked old and haggard, his face deeply wrinkled, his eyes shrunken, his form gaunt. The effect then passed, and Kael'thas's appearance returned to its former state. As Lorthamar whirled and struck out at another undead attacker, he wondered if he might be going mad. Heavy rain began pounding the island. Scores of troll transport ships landed along the southern shore. The warriors immediately debarked and waded into the fray. The heavy truncheon felt clumsy in Liadrin's hand, but what she lacked in finesse she made up for in sheer resolve and unbridled fury. Lorthamar had told her to separate the walking carcasses' heads from their shoulders to ensure their demise, and now the former high priestess was fervently doing exactly that, despite the fact that she wore ill-fitting armor taken from a fallen guardian. You can do this, she thought. You have to do this. Lorthamar cut a swath through a cluster of undead, only to find two former magisters waiting behind it. From their glassy-eyed stares, it was evident that they were not survivors. Rather, they were fallen elves that had been hastily raised by necromancers during the sacking of Silvermoon, then left to rot on the island when Arthas vacated it. The ranger prayed that the magisters had not been brought back from the dead with the same powers they had wielded among the living as he slashed their exposed necks. Thunder rolled. Blinding shafts of light shot from the moon crystals into the Sunwell. Ramath, Kael'thas, and Astalor arched back in unison. Jagged streams of raw energy raked upward, hotter and brighter and far more powerful than the lightning arcing above. One of the Farstriders before Galel yelled as a scourged sword pierced his ribs. The priest calmed his nerves, centered himself, reached out, and touched the light. He channeled its healing properties into the ranger, even as he heard the thunderous boom from offshore, even as he heard the high-pitched shriek of the cannonball's approach, and he felt the connection terminate as the cannonball struck the ground, rebounded, and carried the ranger high into the air, nearly rending his body in two. Galel stopped unmoving. The battle continued to rage all around, but it seemed distant, almost as if it glimpsed through a dream. The elves had planned to drive the undead out toward the attacking Amani to keep them pressed long enough for Kael'thas and the others to complete their spell work, but the trolls were quickly mowing through the scourge. Soon they would obliterate the undead wedge between them and the elves. Lorthamar prayed that the prince and magisters would finish their work before that happened. The ground shook violently. Most of the Farstriders kept their footing, but many of the undead tumbled into the mud. Cracks appeared in the earth and quickly widened into large fissures. Searing energy erupted from below. With the undead I can't tell if this is a sound coming from. Must be. Yeah, it must. I think it's my son's video game in the background. I'm hearing this music. With the undead struggling to get up, Lorthamar could see that easily 100 trolls had surrounded the Sunwell and were now quickly tightening the noose. Their war cries filled the air. The bombardment from the destroyers had stopped. But that was cold comfort in the light of the troll army's onrush. A single beam of pure white energy appeared in the center of the Sunwell shaft. It pulsed, growing with each cycle, expanding. Kael'thas and the magisters were clearly fatigued, pouring every effort into the channeling. The moon crystals had burst into flame now, and swirling green energy fired in their cores. The undead had risen and pressed in toward the Sunwell once more. As Lorthamar defended, he heard cleaving sounds, those of a butcher hacking through meat. A rancid corpse fell before him, and in its place stood a troll berserker. More heavily muscled than their brethren, berserkers were fueled by a cocktail of primitive and dark magic, potions concocted by the shadowy witch doctors that sent the ferocious warriors into a blood-chilling frenzy. This one was covered in tattoos and war paint and carried several thick-bladed spears. Lorthamar swung and missed, cursing the lack of depth perception that had resulted from the loss of his eye. He recovered and struck again. With manic speed, the troll parried and thrust. Searing pain lanced the Ranger Lord's ribs, as the spearhead found an opening in his armor. Nearby, Fallon immediately channeled the healing properties of the light into the wound. The berserker witnessed this, pulled a second spear from his sheath on his back, and hurled it into Fallon's chest. Lorthamar brought his sword down in a two-handed overhead swing, splitting the berserker's skull. He immediately turned and kneeled next to Fallon as two Farstriders rushed to take his place. He could see the light fading from the priest's eyes. He looked around for another priest, saw none nearby, and then it was too late. Fallon's life force was gone. Behind Romath, Solinar felt a crippling grief suddenly overtake him. He looked to the battlefield for his brother, but the scene was utter chaos. He knew, however, at that moment he knew without seeing that Fallon lived no more. Liadrin crushed the skull of a thing that had once been an elven guardian, squinted to see through the rain, and realized with a gut-wrenching despair that the enemy approaching her was familiar. It was an old man wearing the robes of a high priest. She lowered her truncheon as she looked into the spiritless eyes of Vandelor. I cannot do this. You must do not look into his eyes. The walking corpse that had once been Liadrin's mentor and substitute father raked out with long nails, clumsily slashing at her face. His robes were stained a dark crimson, and the center of his chest was nothing more than a ragged, maggot-infested concavity. The former high priestess cursed the light, cursed it with a passion that defied all she had once held to be righteous and true, and buried her truncheon in the side of Vandelor's head. She heard his neck pop. The corpse stumbled and lurched forward. Liadrin adjusted her grip and rotated her entire body into the backswing, and swung a third and final time, successfully wrenching the old elf's head from his shoulders. As the thing that had once been Vandelor fell, Liadrin raised her head to the sky and screamed into the downpour. Romath, Kael'thas, and Astalor backpedaled as the pulsating pillar of blinding light engulfed the violet hues of the Sunwell. It radiated outward with a loud hum that muted all other sound. With one final push it pulsed, then stepped back to the Sunwell's center. The hum was replaced with a sudden silence, broken only by the sound of rain hammering the earth. "Now! Now!" Kael'thas screamed, stretching his arms wide. One by one, the Farstriders, the healers, and finally the Magisters and Kael'thas himself disappeared as the blinding white beam exploded outward, vaporizing everything and everyone in its path. And when it dissipated, left nothing of the Sunwell but a dark and empty hole. No mortal being was alive on Sunstrider Isle to see the massive winged creature fly over. It landed, tucked its head, and folded its wings about its body as the explosion's outer ring slammed into it. In the blast's wake, the giant red dragon stirred unharmed. His form shifted into that of a robed human. The figure lifted his hands, and the diminishing energies of the Sunwell began to coalesce. "Too late," the dragon, who called himself Borel while in this form, thought. As he studied the collecting energies more closely, however, he detected within the faintest glimmer. Perhaps all is not lost. In the center of the former bazaar, Kael'thas and the others shimmered into view. Those who had stayed behind cheered and rushed to embrace the returning party. Out of 20, 17 had lived. Though each of them appeared utterly and thoroughly spent, Kael'thas, Romath, and Astalor seemed even more so, as the flaming remnants of the moon crystals hovered close to them. Lorthamar placed a hand on Solinar's shoulder. "Fallon was killed by one of the trolls. He died so that I might live. I promise you I will spend the remainder of this life seeing that he did not do so in vain." Solinar stared at the Ranger Lord for several seconds, then sat cross-legged on the ground and buried his head in his hands. Liadrin turned to Golel, who had not spoken, whose eyes seemed distant. "Are you unharmed?" The priest simply nodded. Liadrin wrapped an arm around his shoulder and pulled him close. "I know. Believe me, I know." Romath held out his hand, palm up. The moon crystal hovered an inch above it. "The moon crystals endure. Astalor's eyes narrowed. Their power is greatly diminished and no doubt deeply corrupted by the energies they have channeled. But they may be of still some value. The magistrate then turned to Caelthus. My liege, I believe they would be safest in your keeping. The prince looked from his comrade to the stones, which had become small and fiery verdant spheres. Ramath hesitated briefly, then added, He is right. So be it then, Caelthus responded. The two magisters gestured and the orbs floated in front of the prince. He held out his hands and the spheres levitated upward, one above each shoulder. The third hovered above his head as he stepped on the platform and raised his arms to silence the survivors. One of them, a female from Sunwell Anchorage, shouted, Hail to the new king! Hail to King Caelthus! But before the crowd could respond, the prince yelled, No! And there was quiet. Anasterion was our king, and he shall always be remembered as the last king of the High Elves. For now we must focus on what is most important, healing. The prince lowered his hands and continued, Today we fought and destroyed many of our own kind, malign creatures that had once been elves. Elves I had known since childhood, elves I had loved and respected. The Adran tightened her grip on Galal's shoulder, then let go, turned, and walked away. The attack on our people and the destruction of the Sunwell mark a new and dark chapter for all of us. But we shall adapt, and we shall prevail, and we shall rebuild. Lorthamar looked into the eyes of the survivors, and he beheld their growing traces of hopeful anticipation. Even Solinar raised his head and gazed wistfully. We must put this misery behind us. We must enter a new chapter. So I say to you that as of this day, we are no longer High Elves. In honor of the blood that was shed throughout this kingdom, in honor of the sacrifices of our brothers and sisters, our parents and our children, in honor of Anasterion, as of this day we will take the name of our royal lineage. As of this day we are Sindarai. We are Blood Elves. Caelthus surveyed the audience and noted the restless upturned faces, mouths repeating the words, Sindarai, Blood Elves. For Quel'Thalas, the prince shouted. For Quel'Thalas! The prince raised his arms and the verdant orbs around him flared brightly. Hail to the Sindarai! Okay, so that was an okay chapter, but it was instructive in seeing them become the Blood Elves and why they did it. Also, it makes sense why, even though his father died, why he's still called Prince Caelthus when you encounter him in game instead of King Caelthus. So that's an interesting little kind of retcon there. Maybe not even a retcon. Maybe that's just a true story of how it goes. All right, cool. So we got another episode of the Pipe 5x5, which will set us up to continue playing the Frozen Throne. As always, I thank everyone so much for watching and for listening, and I will see you all next time on Lore of Warcraft.